Strong support but uneasy relationships, co-residence and adult children's relationship with their parents, by Lynn K. White and Stacey J. Rogers. So in this article, they begin by talking about how they go straight into literature review and start talking about how there's a substantial amount of research in the last decade that has charted the demographic and life course factors associated with patterns of leaving home and returning to home among young adults, and how there's a due to the increase in numbers in this subject, there's also been an increase in research of the life course factors associated with that subject. They then go on to say how despite this, there's a lot less known about how co-residency and how co-residency and how residence patterns influence parent-child relationships directly during the transition to adulthood. They then go on to talk about how some of the research out there has found that some of the research on home leaving and co-residence is generally premised on the assumption that co-residence is important for the flow of resources from the parent to child and for affection. But these hypotheses have not been widely tested. So he's basically saying that some research is showing this aspect of co-residency, but it hasn't been widely tested, so that's the limitation. He then says that other studies of exchange between parent and child have exempted co-resident children from the studies, and that because apparently on the assumption that exchange is high and invariant in co-resident families. So basically, he says that there's the other research that is out there about this subject focuses their study on the perspective of the parent rather than on the child, and that he thinks this is another limitation on the research available. He also says that only a handful of studies on this subject have documented the quality of interaction within co-resident households. And he says that another related study has found that the key for parents is not whether the children live in the household, but whether they are becoming independent while living in the household or while not living in the household. So yeah, and then he also goes on to say that the other related research is finding that reports of conflict in co-resident homes are lower when the co-resident children are older, and this could be explained because none of the studies and because none of these studies none of the studies about this subject have compared groups of parents of non-resident youth, we cannot determine how co-residence itself affects the relationship. So basically he's basically talking about how a lot of the research out there is very limited and has a lot of its own limitations within the research, and how some of it is finding that it's better there's lower conflict when the child is older, or how it's more the parents care more about whether the child is independent over if they're just living in the house, but that all of this research hasn't really had like another sample of respondents that to compare the groups of parents of non-resident youth. and this creates a limitation. He also then goes on to say that there is also previous research that suggests that the effects of co-residence on parent-child solidarity also may be moderated by gender, the family's socioeconomic resources, and family structure. They also say that other research suggests that young adult children have more autonomy in lower income families than in higher income families, and that their incomes are more directly comparable with those of their parents, and that they are more likely to make a useful contribution to the family's economy. Finally, he says how through through this research that he's mentioned and others, that we know that children growing up in a single parent or step parent family are less likely to be co-resident because it usually is contributed to a greater family tension. And then he goes on to like the limitations of all of the research that he's mentioned. And he says that all the research that he just presented addresses the question of how parent-child solidarity is affected by co-residence during the transition to adulthood. But that he says that with that in mind, that there is two main problems that have kept the previous researchers, the ones he's just mentioned, from answering that question about solidarity in the most effective way. First, the first reason is that most of these surveys that these previous researchers have been using in their research have skipped co-resident families when asking about exchange. And second, because these researchers, the distribution of families into co-residence and independence is hardly a random process, and the selection effects have presented a critical problem in previous cross-sectional research. And he says that they in this current research that we're discussing have found a way to overcome these problems. And this is when he starts talking about his methods. So basically, in this research, they're using data on adult children and their parents from the marital instability over the life course study. And this is a national sample of adults. A national sample of adults were interviewed 4 times between 1980 and 1992, and their adult children were interviewed in 1992 as well. And although the children's data is cross-sectional, the data from the parents panel allowed them to provide much more effective control of selection effects than previous studies have. Through these, another thing to know about this is that they were telephone interviews. They were conducted with a random sample of 2,034 married individuals under the age of 55 who were selected through a clustered random digit dialing procedure. Anyways, through these telephone interviews, they were able to obtain reports on the quality of family life from 5 years prior to current co-residence, and they also were able to obtain information from the parent's perspective as well as the child's, which this obviously increases the value of this research because it's fixing and overcoming all the previous limitations that these other researchers have had in their research, and these other researchers have found in their research. He says an additional benefit of this current research is that it includes identical questions about exchange and social support for both resident and non-resident children. And that this is very important because through this they're able to test the implicit assumption made by earlier studies that exchange is high and invariant between co-resident children and their parents. So basically, he's here to explain to you how his methods in this study, and how through his methods he's fixing all of the problems in the literature review. Basically, he goes on to say about what they will be examining. He says that they are going to be examining 4 dimensions of the parent-child relationship from the child's perspective, which include affective closeness, giving help to parents, receiving help from parents, and perceived supportiveness of parents. And their primary question focuses on how co-residence how co-residence relates to these 4 dimensions of parent-child relations, controlling for selection processes. And that's basically it for the method. So now on to the results. So in the results, they found that co-residency did not appear to increase the exchange of resources between parents and adult children, but I'm sorry, that co-residency does appear to increase the exchange of resources between parents and adult children, but that this increase of resources only occurs at some cost. That this increase in resources occurs at the cost of relationship quality. They found that co-residers exchange significantly more help with parents than children who live within a few miles of their parents, and exchange is obviously lower with each increment in distance between the parent and the child. Another major finding of this study was that on average, that although the exchange they exchange more and perceive more support from parents, that they found this study found that co-resident children on average evaluate their effective relationship with their parents more negatively than children who do not live with their parents. um and it's also another thing they found is that the impact of co-residence varies significantly depending on the characteristics of the child and specifically on their place in the transition to adulthood. So, basically, they found that different characteristics of that certain child who is co-residing, um, and how, um, like, how individual and independent that child is, and how like on the road to adulthood they are, how much that does have a definite impact on how on the positive on the perception of the co-residency in the eyes of both the adult and the parent, in the eyes of both the adult child and the parent. Excuse me. Um, they all this study also had a major finding that, um, according to the children's reports, co-residency is a more positive experience when the child is older, in school, unemployed. So basically, once the child is more independent and more still becoming an adult, even though they're living with their parents, it's still, as long as they're still becoming an adult, that led to more positive experience within the co-residency. And the last major finding of this study was that parent-child relationships are shown to be major sources of both support and stress, and that in this research it suggested that both support and stress are greater under conditions of co-residency. Results in this study show that co-resident young adults give, receive, and perceive more support from their parents than non-resident children, but that they also report significantly lower effective relationships with their parents. Um, the effects of co-residence are more positive. This study also found that the effects of co-residency are more positive when children are more adult and responsible, which is what I was trying to explain before. That if they're like older or employed or in school, that usually led to more positive perceptions of the co-residency. And lastly, parent co-residence and Co-residence and proximity are strongly related to parent-child solidarity, but parents' reports of the quality of prior family relationships have surprisingly little effect on the likelihood of co-residence or on children's reports of current relationships.